Hey, hello, welcome again. Thank you for coming back and checking out the next installment of my vlog, I think is what it's called, isn't it? A video log of excitement for you sonic sorcerers, audio alchemists and musical mystic mellowers, if you will. What I wanted to talk about in this lesson was symmetrical scales and the triadic pairs within symmetrical scales. It's hoped that we're at a basic level where we already have a comprehension of the chromatic scale and a basic understanding of harmony. I was always taught when we're playing the saxophone, get a grip on the piano as well. I was very lucky from day one to study piano, very badly I might add. I like to call it street piano is what I play, but just enough so that we can explore the world of harmony, because as we know the saxophone is a melodic instrument and we can only play one note at a time. Okay, so if nothing else, if you don't have any basic piano skills, do make it your business to learn some, because as a saxophone player it will be incredibly useful for you moving forward. Now, what I want to talk about today, like I said, symmetrical scales and triad pairs within those. You might say, what are symmetrical scales? I don't know what you're talking about, blah blah, you were crazy. Let's go and look at the chromatic scale, because I want to start from there, right? There's only 12 notes in the chromatic scale, isn't there? And if we think that every single musical endeavour up to this point in time has used only 12 notes, it's pretty amazing, isn't it, really? So if we take the chromatic scale, and I'm going to play on the tenor saxophone C to C, which is concert B flat to B flat. Okay, that's a chromatic scale. Now, symmetry is something that I think is very important. For me, anyway. Now, this is where we come back to something I mentioned in the last couple of videos. There's no wrong or right with music. It's totally your own individual aesthetic. Marcel Mule has a completely different approach to the alto saxophone than Maceo Parker. Okay? Dewey Redman has a completely different approach to the saxophone than Kenny G. There's no right or wrong. It's what's right for you as an individual. But part of the journey is to find what's right for you yourself. I'll try and make this succinct. Somebody said I should keep these videos to about 5 minutes, but I do have a tendency to go on about things, but maybe that's what you like about these videos, I don't know. So, symmetrical scales coming from the chromatic scale. Now we know that the chromatic scale has 12 notes, right? Now if we divide the chromatic scale in half, now I'm not talking about going C to F sharp, then F sharp to C. I'm talking about dividing it in half so we get two whole tone scales parallel with each other. So here's the chromatic scale. And if we divide it in half, we get the two whole tone scales. Okay. So if we divide a chromatic scale into two, we get the two augmented scale, beg your pardon, we get the two whole tone scales. So what I've done, as always, with my brilliant literacy skills, can you see what I'm saying? We're not splitting it in half C to F sharp, we're splitting it in half symmetrically like that. So we get one whole tone scale at the top, one whole tone scale at the bottom. So if we divide a chromatic scale into two, we get two whole tone scales. Now this is what I wanted to talk about the triadic pairs, because if we take that whole tone scale, I'll deal with the first one, just C. We have two triads within that scale, two augmented triads. So we have C, E, G sharp, C, D, F sharp, B flat, D. So as an improviser, I find it very helpful to think, well, if I wanted to improvise a line that had a whole tone idea, all I'm trying to do is link together two triads of an augmented nature, because coming from the whole tone scale, it's built on tones, isn't it? If we look back at this sheet, we can see C to D as a tone, D to E as a tone, E to F sharp to G sharp to A sharp to C. They're tones, right? So it's called the whole tone scale. So the two triads within a whole tone scale are two augmented triads. C, E, G sharp, D, F sharp, A sharp, and then it just repeats, right? So we get E, G sharp, C, F sharp, A sharp, D, G sharp, C, E, and so on and so forth. So if we just play those triads going up the whole tone scale, and we're talking about a C whole tone scale here, and then there's variations that we can use our creativity to try and perhaps come up with something a bit more interesting. We could go okay, does that make sense? So we're just taking the whole tone scale and looking at the two triad pairs within that whole tone scale to improvise. So if we played a lick like a, which I think was the lick I played to start with, which was just using those two triad pairs. Or something similar. I don't know, I can't definitely play the same thing twice. Now, you might say, if you're at an advanced level, oh, triad pairs, yeah, blah, 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 that's not very interesting, because they're quite predictable. And there is a sense of that. And obviously, when we get into more advanced stages of improvising, we can look at things like approach notes to these triad pairs. So if we were playing, we could play, which is approaching it from a semitone below, or a semitone above would be, but that's a little bit further down the line if that's something that interests you, but don't be afraid to explore that stuff. So chromatic scale divided into two gives us two whole tone scales. The first would be a C whole tone, and the second a C sharp whole tone. So on a C sharp whole tone, the triad pairs there are going to be C sharp, F, A, E flat, G, B. So that's how I think about the whole tone scale, just as two augmented triads. And I find it very helpful to think about it that way, because it frees me up when I'm improvising to explore ideas and options. Because it's a very symmetrical scale, it lends itself well to patterns. But obviously, like we said in the earlier video, we want to try and avoid just endless eighth note patterns, because they can get a little bit predictable. So break up the rhythms. We don't always need to practice things in eighth notes, right? We could have maybe, okay, or there's a million possibilities, but it's up to you to work these out for yourself, because that's where the magic lies. If we get the books that everyone else has and we all play the same stuff, we all sound the same. And I think this is one of the downsides of music education schools, in that they reward conformity. They don't encourage individuality. And it's very important to strive for that, I think, as improvisers nowadays. So that was the first one, right? Chromatic scale divided into two whole tone scales. If we get the chromatic scale and divide it into three, what do you think we get? Any ideas? You've got it. 3 diminished scales. Okay. Here's my wonderful sheet here. You'll have to excuse me if it looks a little bit hokey pokey, but it'll do for now. So can you see, if we divide a chromatic scale into 3, we get a C chromatic scale into 3 diminished scales, I beg your pardon. I always think of a diminished scale starting with the tone Some people use it starting with the semitones. No right or wrong, however you learn it. It's about the sound, okay? But if we divide a chromatic scale into 3, we get the 3 diminished scales. And a diminished scale is made up of a tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone. Unlike the whole tone scale, which was just tone, tone, tone. So the diminished scales, tone, semitone, tone, semitone. So if we divide our chromatic scale into 3, we get 3 diminished scales. That's the first one. That's the second. And that's the third. Now when we get to the fourth, all we're doing is repeating the first one again. That's why they're symmetrical, because there's only 3 of them, and then they start repeating themselves. Now, very useful thing to know, a diminished scale contains 4 dominant sevenths. Okay, each diminished scale has 4 dominant sevenths within it. Now, I don't want to talk too much about this now. I may make another video about it, but the dominant 7 is really where the magic lies as an improviser. But just so long as we know that diminished scales contain 4 dominant 7s. So if we take that first scale I played, we've got D7, F7, A flat 7, B7. Okay, plus the extensions as well, the sharp 9s and the flat 9s, which is really super cool. So if you're at an advanced stage of improvising, look into that. Look into the 4 dominants within a diminished. It's super useful. But all I wanted to do was talk about the triad pairs within a diminished scale. So just as the whole tone scale was just 2 whole tone triads put together to get the scale, a diminished scale can be made up of just taking the diminished triads. So if we take a C diminished, all that is a C diminished triad and then a D diminished triad. Right? So again, thinking about diminished scales as just 2 diminished triads helps as an improviser. There's so many diminished patterns. They're super symmetrical scales, and obviously we all know the famous Coltrane one, which has kind of been done to death a little bit. So but one of the reasons is because people always play it that way. If we just break up the rhythm and try to not play the 8th notes, we might have which already sounds a bit more interesting. But thinking about these diminished triads within the diminished scale. Yeah? And then you can take it anywhere, really. That was using a C diminished. If we take a C sharp diminished, it would be a and I just find it helps to just think about those 2 diminished triads within the diminished scale. Now we could take it a little bit further and say a diminished chord, put the 4th note on, so we'd have but the diminished triad, when you get to the 4th note, if you start it on the 2nd, it's just repeating itself anyway. So by playing the triad, you're playing it all anyway, right? And if we played the last diminished scale, which would be the one starting on D, we've got that's how I think about a diminished scale, just two diminished arpeggios, basically. Now there's, like I say, it lends itself really well to a number of patterns and permutations. There's so much that you can do with these diminished scales. They really can open up a world of sonic possibilities to you because of the permutations. There's just so many. Really worth exploring. But remember, 3 diminished scales is just a chromatic scale divided into 3. Okay, so we get the chromatic scale, divide it into 2, we get 2 whole tone scales. We take the chromatic scale and divide it into 3, and we get 3, there we go, 3, and we get the 3 diminished scales. And each diminished scale is just made up of 2 diminished triads. Does that make sense? And again, if you're an advanced improviser, you could look at playing approach notes onto those triads, any number of things. I don't know where you're at with your improvisations, but obviously approach notes is another thing we can talk about later in another video if you like. So let me keep moving because I can see time is running out and so much for my 5-minute video. Right. And lastly, because this is the last one now, if we split the chromatic scale into 4, any takers? What we got? You've got it, right? 4 augmented scales. Now we know the whole tone scale was built on tone, 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 tone. The diminished tone, semitone, tone, semitone, tone, semitone. Augmented scales are built on a tone and a semitone, which is a minor third, and then a semitone. Tone and a semitone and a semitone. Okay, so there's 4. If we look at my sheet here, wonderful, another example. Divide a chromatic scale into 4 and we get 4 augmented scales. Can you see that? C, C sharp, D and E flat. And they're only 4 because when we get to E, we're back to repeating C again, right? Now the augmented scale is made up of our 2 augmented triads. You remember on the whole tone scale, we had the 2 whole tone triad pairs that were made up of a tone apart. Well, the augmented scale is just 2 augmented triads that are a semitone apart. So if we take the augmented scale starting on C, we've got a C augmented triad and an E flat augmented triad. You see there a semitone apart there, C, E, G sharp, B, E flat, G. Okay, again, really useful to help. Somebody might say, oh, I want you to improvise with a whole tone sound, and you might be thinking, oh, I don't know what to do. We know, obviously, the great Oliver Nelson one, right? Which I think is off Blues and the Abstract Truth, but again, a bit done to death. But by thinking of just these triad pairs, okay, so that's the augmented scale. So if we divide the chromatic scale into 4, we get 4 augmented scales. C augmented, C sharp augmented, D augmented, and E flat augmented. And each one is built up of a minor third semitone, minor third semitone, minor third semitone. So hopefully this has been of some use to somebody somewhere, maybe not, and it goes into cyberspace and gets put in the delete box for eternity. But that's okay, doesn't matter really. The more people that are just sharing things of knowledge and inspiration and hopefully a bit of enthusiasm, it might help somebody somewhere. So the chromatic scale divided into two whole tone scales. Divide it into three, we get three diminished. And divide it into four, we get the four augmented scales. Okay, so hopefully that was of some use. My name's Johnny Lippiett. This is my new series of internet blogging, vlogging, or I don't know, flogging a dead horse. I don't know what we call it. And as we say, there's no right or wrong way for music. Everyone's got their own approach. Somebody might say this is all rubbish. Somebody might say it's brilliant. If you ask a million people, you'll get a million different answers. The way to move forward, I think, as a learner of anything is to explore it for ourselves and the independent investigation of the truth. And the truth is the records. And everything lies in the past. That's the irony of jazz music. All the answers to everything we want to know lie in the past. Yes, we have all these wonderful jazz schools with no shortage of books and transcription records, but we don't learn anything by just playing a transcription out of a book. We play it when we learn by playing it off the records ourselves and using our ears. So hopefully that was some help. And augmented scales, diminished scales, whole tone scales, triad pairs within those, and it all comes from symmetry, and it all comes from just the 12-note chromatic scale. And like we say, when you think what people have done with just 12 notes, it's utterly mind-blowing and completely profound. So hopefully that was useful, and my name is Johnny Lippiett from Brooklyn, New York. Sayonara, signing out, and I'll see you tomorrow for another exciting installment. So stay tuned, click my likes, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time. Hasta la vista.